Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex stuff, break it down, and give you the distilled insight. Today, let's start with something kind of strange from history. Think about Europe, say around 1900. Mostly peaceful, right? Lots of optimism, trade was booming, democracy spreading. Yet the 20th century turned into one of its absolute bloodiest periods. 2 world wars. How does that happen?
It's a really stark contrast, isn't it? And it's a good reminder that what you see on the surface in world politics isn't always the whole story. There are often deeper forces at work.
Exactly. And that's what we're plunging into today, let's call it the compelling, but sometimes pretty unsettling world of great power politics. Our main source for this deep dive is a really influential book by John J. Mearsheimer, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. So if you're prepping for a meeting, trying to make sense of the news, or honestly, if you're just curious about what makes big countries tick, this one's definitely for you.
Yeah, our mission here is really to unpack Mearsheimer's big theory. It's called offensive realism. And it's basically a framework he lays out that tries to help us understand why powerful nations act the way they do, and maybe even anticipate what's coming next. We'll dig into the core assumptions, see how it stacks up against other, maybe more optimistic views, look at how military power fits in, strategy, and then see how these ideas hold up against actual history, from the 1790s right up to the world after the Cold War. It gives you a lens, really.
Okay, let's get into that core idea then. Offensive realism.
Mm.
The big question driving it seems to be, why are great powers always looking for more power? What's going on?
Well, the starting point for Mearsheimer, and it's fundamental, is this concept of the international system being anarchic. Now, anarchy here doesn't mean, total chaos. It means there's no world government, no 911 for nations to call if they get into trouble.
Right. So no global authority to keep order or protect states from each other.
Exactly. It's a self-help system. States are basically on their own, and because of that, their absolute #1 goal has to be survival. Everything else is secondary.
Okay, so survival first. No world police. That makes sense. And Mearsheimer builds on this with, 5 main assumptions?
Yeah, 5 bedrock assumptions. The first one we just mentioned, anarchy. No higher authority.
That's on.
Second, every great power has offensive capabilities. They all possess the military means to potentially harm, maybe even destroy their neighbors. It's not just theoretical.
Okay, so everyone's potentially dangerous. That leads to the third one, which feels key. Uncertain intentions.
Absolutely key. You can never be 100% sure what another state really intends to do. Are they friendly or just biding their time?
And even if they seem okay now, they might change later,
Yeah.
right? New leader, different circumstances.
Precisely. Intentions can shift, and quickly. So if you can't be sure about others' long-term goals, well, what do? You have to assume the worst or at least prepare for it.
Which leads straight to number 4. Survival is key. It's the ultimate aim. If you don't survive, none of your other goals matter.
You got it. And the fifth one is that states are generally rational actors. This doesn't mean they always make perfect decisions, but they tend to think strategically and make calculated choices to maximize their odds of survival based on the information they have.
Okay, so let's put it together. Anarchy? Everyone can hurt you. You can't trust anyone's intentions. Survival is paramount, and states try to act rationally. Now, here's the offensive part of offensive realism. Mearsheimer says the logical conclusion isn't just to build defenses, but to actively seek more power, to become the biggest fish.
That's the crucial twist. In this dangerous, uncertain world, the best guarantee of survival, according to offensive realism, is to become the most powerful state you can possibly be. Ideally, a regional hegemon, the undisputed top dog in your own neighborhood.
So the best defense is a good offense, essentially. Dominate your region so no one in your region can threaten you.
Exactly. Great powers feel this constant pressure to think offensively, to look for opportunities to increase their power relative to others. And importantly, Mearsheimer argues this isn't driven by some innate lust for conquest or, irrational aggression. It's a calculated, strategic response to the structure of the international system itself. It's about ensuring survival in the long run.
Okay, that's a powerful, if maybe a bit bleak picture. But Mearsheimer acknowledges this isn't the only theory out there, right? He contrasts it with other views.
Oh, absolutely. He spends a good chunk of the book contrasting realism, particularly his offensive version, with what he calls the liberal tradition, which is generally much more optimistic about peace and cooperation.
Right, liberalism, stemming from the Enlightenment and all that. What are the main pillars of that view?
Liberals typically point to 3 main things they believe promote peace. First, economic interdependence. The idea here is that if countries trade a lot and their economies are deeply intertwined,
They won't want to fight because it would wreck the economy for everyone, including themselves. Makes intuitive sense. Why blow up the system making you rich?
that's the logic. Shared prosperity is supposed to dampen the desire for war. Second, there's the democratic peace theory.
Ah, yeah, the idea that democracies don't, or rarely, fight other democracies. If that holds, it's a pretty strong argument for spreading democracy.
It's a very appealing idea. And the third pillar is international institutions. Think the UN, NATO, the EU. Liberals argue these organizations help foster cooperation, build trust, create rules of the road, and provide ways to resolve disputes peacefully. They reduce the uncertainty that realists worry about.
So economic ties, shared democratic values, and international organizations working together, that paints a much brighter picture.
It does. But Mearsheimer pushes back hard against this liberal optimism. He argues these factors are often overestimated or just don't work the way liberals hope, especially when it comes to great powers.
How so? What's his take on institutions, for example?
Well, he argues that institutions like the UN ultimately have very little independent power. They reflect the balance of power among the great powers. They don't really shape it. They lack real coercive leverage. Basically, great powers will ignore institutions if they think their vital interests, especially survival, are at stake.
Okay, so institutions are maybe weaker than they look.
Yeah.
What about economic interdependence? Doesn't that stop wars?
Not necessarily, Mearsheimer would say. High interdependence didn't stop World War I, for instance. Europe was incredibly interconnected economically in 1914. Plus, economic ties can create dependencies and vulnerabilities, which can sometimes even increase friction or become weapons themselves. And economic crises can definitely fuel conflict.
And the democratic peace theory, that one seems pretty solid statistically, doesn't it?
Yeah. It has some empirical support, yes, but Mearsheimer points out what he calls the backsliding problem. A country might be a democracy today, but will it be one tomorrow? Think about transitions, democratic breakdowns. From a realist perspective, you can't bet your survival on another state remaining democratic indefinitely. Prudence dictates you prepare for the possibility it might change.
So his point is that these liberal factors might have some effect, but they don't fundamentally change the underlying anarchic structure and the security competition it breeds. It really makes you question, are we being too optimistic sometimes?
That's precisely the challenge he poses. Are the old rules still in play, even if we wish they weren't?
Okay, so if states are competing for power, what kind of power are we talking about? Is it just money, influence,
Yeah.
or something more specific?
It's definitely related to wealth because wealth funds it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, for Mearsheimer, power boils down to military capability, particularly potential military capability and actual military forces.
Military mind.
Okay.
Okay. And he has a specific, maybe even controversial take on what kind of military power matters most.
He does. And it's really interesting. You might think, especially today, about air power or sea power, cutting-edge tech. But Mearsheimer argues forcefully that land power is the dominant form of military power.
Land power. Armies, even now.
Even now, his argument is that armies, supported by air and naval forces, of course, are the only forces that can decisively seize and hold territory, overthrow enemy governments, and control populations. That's what ultimately wins wars and determines the political outcome.
So things like blockades by navies or strategic bombing by air forces, they're important but not decisive on their own.
Exactly. He sees them as playing ancillary roles. They can inflict a lot of pain, disrupt economies, weaken the enemy, but they rarely compel surrender by themselves. Think about strategic bombing in World War II, or even more recent air campaigns. They punish, but victory, in Mearsheimer's view, usually requires boots on the ground to seal the deal.
That makes sense when you put it like that. It connects to another really interesting concept he uses, the stopping power of water.
Yes. This is crucial for understanding global strategy. Large bodies of water oceans basically act as massive defensive barriers. They make large-scale amphibious invasions incredibly difficult and costly, especially against a well-defended shore.
So trying to invade across an ocean is way harder than marching across a land border.
Much, much harder. And this geographical reality explains a lot. It explains why powers like the UK historically and the US today behave differently from continental powers like France, Germany, or Russia.
Because they're islands, or effectively islands, protected by water. They have a natural buffer.
Precisely. It gives them a degree of security that continental powers just don't have. It allows them to be offshore balancers, as we'll see. It's a huge strategic advantage.
Okay, so geography and land power are key. Now, when a state does see a dangerous rival emerging, maybe a potential hegemon. How do they react? What are the strategies?
Mearsheimer lays out a few main responses. The most direct one is balancing. This is when a threatened state, or a coalition of states, actively takes steps to contain the aggressor. Building up arms, forming alliances, basically confronting the threat head-on.
Okay, stand up to the bully. Seems straightforward.
It is, but it's also costly and risky. Which is why Mearsheimer argues that the preferred strategy, whenever possible, is buck passing.
Buck passing, trying to get someone else to do the balancing.
Exactly. You see a rising threat, but instead of confronting it yourself, you try to get another powerful state to take on the burden of stopping them. You want them to bear the costs and risks of potential war.
That sounds very human. Let someone else deal with it. Why is that preferred?
Well, because if you succeed, the potential aggressor gets checked, but you didn't have to pay the price in blood or treasure. You preserve your own strength while others weaken themselves fighting. It's strategically very appealing if you can pull it off.
But it seems risky too, right?
Yeah.
What if everyone tries to pass the buck and no one stops the aggressor?
That's the huge danger. Widespread buck passing can allow an aggressor to gain power unchecked, which is often how you end up in really bad situations, like the lead up to World War II.
And what about other strategies, like trying to make deals with the aggressor, appeasement, or even joining them, bandwagoning?
Mearsheimer sees those as generally really bad ideas. Appeasement, giving concessions, usually just emboldens the aggressor and makes them stronger. And bandwagoning, joining the likely winner, is incredibly dangerous because you're siding with the biggest threat. He argues these are rarely rational strategies for survival in the long run.
So it's mainly about balancing versus buck passing. When does a state choose one over the other?
A lot depends on the situation, especially geography. Remember the stopping power of water.
Right. If you're separated from the threat by an ocean.
Like the US or the UK relative to continental Europe, you're much more likely to try and pass the buck first. Let the local powers deal with it. You only step in, you only balance directly if the local powers fail and the aggressor looks like they might dominate the whole region.
But if you share a land border with the rising power,
Then buck passing is much harder and riskier. The threat is immediate. You're more likely to have to balance directly, probably by forming alliances with other threatened neighbors. Geography really shapes the strategic options.
okay, this framework is starting to come together. Does Mearsheimer show how this plays out in actual history?
Yes, a huge part of the book is testing the theory against the historical record of great power behavior, roughly from the French Revolution onwards.
Who does he look at?
He examines several key cases, for example, Imperial Japan from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 up to 1945. He portrays Japan as a classic offensive realist state, constantly looking for opportunities to expand its power in Asia whenever the balance of power seemed favorable.
Makes sense, given their actions. What about Europe?
Germany, of course, is a central case. From Bismarck's unification wars through Wilhelmine Germany before World War I, and then Nazi Germany, Mearsheimer interprets this history as a relentless drive for regional hegemony in a highly competitive European environment.
A consistent pattern of seeking dominance.
And the Soviet Union, too. He argues their expansionist tendencies were driven by deep-seated security fears stemming from Russia's vulnerable geography. Even Gorbachev's reforms at the end, often seen as a change of heart.
You mentioned he sees that as driven by necessity.
Right. Primarily economic weakness, the need for a strategic pause, not necessarily a fundamental shift away from pursuing security through power.
Okay, Japan, Germany, the Soviet Union. Those seem like fairly clear cases of aggressive powers. But what about the United States? We often see ourselves differently.
Mearsheimer applies the same logic. He argues the U.S. was highly expansionist in its own hemisphere, achieving regional hegemony through actions like Manifest Destiny and enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, basically clearing out European rivals and dominating North America.
So aggressive in our own backyard.
That's his take. And then, globally, the U.S. acts as an offshore balancer. Because of the stopping power of water, it prefers to stay out of conflicts in Europe and Asia. It prefers to buck pass to local powers to contain any potential hegemon there. But, crucially, the U.S. will intervene directly balance if buck passing fails and a single power threatens to dominate either Europe or Northeast Asia. Think World War I, World War II, the Cold War.
So the U.S. strategy is driven by the same realist logic, just shaped by its unique geographic position. It waits until it absolutely has to step in.
That's the argument. It waits until a regional hegemon looks likely to emerge because that's seen as a direct threat to U.S. security down the line.
This framework also connects the structure of the system, how many great powers there are, to how likely war is, right?
Yes, the concept of polarity. He argues the distribution of power significantly affects stability, and his conclusion is a bit counterintuitive.
How so?
He finds that bipolarity, a system with only two great powers, like the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War, is actually the most stable and least prone to great power war.
Really? The Cold War felt pretty tense. Why would that be stable?
Because with only two main players, the lines are clear. There are fewer potential conflict points between the great powers themselves. Miscalculations are less likely, and balancing is more straightforward. They keep a very close eye on each other. Deterrence is clearer.
Okay, fewer chances for things to spiral out of control between the big two. What's the most dangerous setup then?
That would be unbalanced multipolarity. This is a system with multiple great powers, but one of them is significantly stronger than the others, a potential hegemon.
Like Napoleonic France?
What?
Or Germany before the World War?
Exactly, those periods. When one state looks like it could dominate the system, it creates intense fear among the others. This leads to risky strategies, lots of buck passing that might fail. It's a recipe for major wars. The historical record for these periods is incredibly bloody.
Wow. So having a clear potential winner actually makes things more dangerous.
According to the theory, yes. Because it maximizes fear and uncertainty. And then there's balanced multipolarity. Multiple great powers, but no single one is strong enough to make a bid for hegemony.
Like Europe for much of the 19th century after Napoleon.
Right. This is sort of in the middle. More opportunities for war than bipolarity because there are more players and interactions, but less intense fear and instability than when there's a clear potential hegemon looming.
Okay, so the structure really matters. Bipolar is stable, unbalanced multipolar is dangerous, balanced multipolar is somewhere in between.
That's the framework.
So let's bring this to the present, or at least the recent past and near future. After the Cold War ended, there was a lot of optimism, wasn't there? People thought great power politics was maybe over.
Huge optimism. The dominant view, especially in the West, was that we were entering a new era, driven by globalization, democracy, international institutions. The liberal view seemed triumphant. President Clinton talked about enlightened self-interest leading to cooperation.
The end of history vibe.
Something like that. But Mearsheimer, writing not long after the Cold War ended, was deeply skeptical. He argued that the fundamental structure hadn't changed.
The bedrock assumptions were still there.
Exactly. The world was still anarchic. States still had to worry about survival. They still had military power. Intentions were still uncertain. And institutions still lacked real coercive power over great states. The underlying logic of offensive realism, he argued, remained fully intact.
So what did he predict? What about Europe, for example? It seems pretty peaceful now.
Mearsheimer attributes Europe's current peace largely to what he calls the American pacifier. The large U.S. military presence essentially keeps a lid on old rivalries.
So the U.S. acts as an external force imposing stability.
That's his argument. And he predicts that if the U.S. were to significantly withdraw its forces from Europe, well, the old dynamics would likely reassert themselves. Security competition would return. States like Germany or Russia might start acting more assertively. Other states would react, and the potential for conflict would rise again.
That's a sobering thought. What about Asia, particularly China's rise?
This is where Mearsheimer sees the theory playing out most dramatically in the 21st century. China is clearly a rising power with enormous potential, and its leaders are often described as practitioners of realpolitik, which is very much in line with realist thinking.
So from an offensive realist perspective, a rising China will inevitably seek regional hegemony in Asia, just like the U.S. did in the Americas.
That's the logical expectation based on the theory. As China gets more powerful, it will want to dominate its region to ensure its own security, pushing rivals, especially the U.S., out.
And how would the U.S. react to that?
Just as the theory predicts, the U.S. would react to any potential hegemon in a key region by trying to contain it. First, maybe trying to get China's neighbors to do the heavy lifting buck passing.
Like strengthening alliances with Japan, South Korea, India.
Exactly. But if that doesn't work, the U.S. would have to engage in direct balancing itself, leading an anti-China coalition, maintaining a strong military presence. It sets up a classic security dilemma and potential conflict spiral.
He mentions the U.S. policy of engaging China, trying to integrate it into the global economy. He sees that as problematic.
From his perspective, yes, because if China is behaving according to offensive realist logic, then engagement is essentially helping your future rival get stronger. He argues the U.S. actually has a strategic interest in seeing China's economic growth slow down because economic power is the foundation of military power.
That sounds pretty confrontational. Is he saying conflict is inevitable?
He's very pessimistic. He sees an intense security competition between the US and China as virtually unavoidable if China continues its rise. He asks, quite pointedly, if a powerful China isn't the most dangerous potential threat to the United States, precisely because it might follow this realist path to hegemony.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up. We've journeyed through Mearsheimer's world of offensive realism. We've seen the core logic. Anarchy forces states, especially great powers, to relentlessly seek power for survival.
Right. We talked about the bedrock assumptions, the critique of liberal optimism, the surprising emphasis on land power, and the strategies states use balancing versus that preferred option, buck passing.
And we saw how this lens can reinterpret history, looking at powers like Japan, Germany, the Soviets, and even the US, and how the structure of the system itself influences the likelihood of war.
And finally, how this realist logic persists today, potentially shaping the future of Europe and, most critically, the relationship between the US and a rising China.
It certainly suggests that the fundamental drivers of great power politics, this relentless quest for security in a world without guarantees, are maybe far more enduring than we sometimes like to think.
It's a powerful, if uncomfortable, perspective to keep in mind.
Definitely. And it leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. When you look at global events today, even diplomatic initiatives or economic deals that seem cooperative on the surface, to what extent might they still be influenced or even driven by this underlying persistent logic of national power and security competition? Something to ponder.